The control of small intestinal motility is shown on this table. So we can see that there's an increase in gastric motility and emptying, and the mechanism for that is the gastroileal reflex, which is a long reflex, meaning that it involves nerves outside of the GI tract. And the effects of that is to increase motility in the ileum and relax the ileocecal valve, the valve between the last part of the small intestine and the first part of the large intestine. There's also reduced intestinal volume or fasting that occurs, and the effect on small intestine motility is that it initiates migrating motor complex, which basically is peristalsis. That's the alternating contraction and relaxation that occurs in the GI tract, and it repeats until the next meal, basically. And the mechanism for this is one that we've already mentioned. It's a hormone called motilin. And so that also initiates long reflexes, but also short neuroreflexes, which are basically nerves that are already built into the wall of the GI tract. So the function of the GI organs are nicely summarized in this overview table. So I'm going to zoom in so we see a little bit more closely. And so in the mouth and the accessory organs, there are several factors that occur, several functions. Ingestion, so that would be the voluntary intake of food. Propulsion, so voluntary, the buccal phase, where it's the chewing phase and then swallowing, called deglutition. Mechanical breakdown is the chewing by the teeth and mixing movements of the tongue. And then finally, digestion. And at this point, the main enzyme that's in saliva is called salivary amylase, which breaks down starch. So in the next part of the GI tract, in the pharynx and the esophagus, the main function is propulsion, and that's the peristaltic waves moving food forward to the stomach. And notice that this is an involuntary phase. So we choose to move the food forward in the mouth, but then once it reaches to the esophagus, it's going to the stomach. So in the next part of the GI tract, there is mechanical breakdown and propulsion. This mechanical breakdown is very important because there's an additional layer of muscle that helps to break down the food to form it into this paste structure called chyme. There's also digestion. This is the first place where proteins are broken down because of pepsin. And you should know how pepsin is activated. And finally, there is some absorption. It's just a little bit, but it's absorption of substances like water, aspirin, alcohol, and some drugs. So this explains why we get drunk so quickly, especially if we haven't had anything to eat before drinking said liquid. So the next part of this table is the small intestine and the associated accessory organs like the liver, pancreas, and the gallbladder. So there's mechanical breakdown and propulsion that occurs by the smooth muscle that's lining the small intestine. Digestion from the enzymes, not only from the pancreas, but also the brush border enzymes, which are released from the individual cells that are attached to the microvilli membranes. Then finally, absorption. This is the main location for absorption, is the small intestine, specifically the first part of the small intestine, called the duodenum. And then finally, in the large intestine, the last part of the GI tract, we have some digestion. There's some remaining food residues that are digested by gut bacteria. And these bacteria are super important if we have had an antibiotic that may have removed some of the bacteria. A lot of times your doctor wants you to take lactobacillus or eat yogurt, something that contains that bacteria, to replenish it. There's absorption that happens. The main function of the large intestine is absorption of water, electrolytes and vitamins, propulsion, And this propulsion at this point is called mass movements. And finally, defecation, the reflex triggered by rectal distension. So this chart does a great job of summarizing all of those functions. Our next slide is showing the gross anatomy of the large intestine. And remember, the large intestine is shorter than the small intestine. It has no villi, so its anatomy is quite different. And it has these bands of longitudinal smooth muscle in the muscularis, which are called tinea coli. So they're bands of longitudinal smooth muscle in the muscularis. And there are what are referred to as haustra. These are pocket-like sacs that are caused by the tone of the tinea coli. So the subdivisions of the large intestine, the first one is called the cecum. So the ileocecal valve is what separates the ileum from the cecum. And the next part is the appendix, which is a mass of lymphoid tissue. And it's also called the vermiform appendix. Then after that point, the other subdivisions of the large intestine, also called the colon, include the ascending colon, the part that travels up, the transverse colon, the descending colon, sigmoid colon, and that finally empties into the rectum and the anal canal. So one important feature of the large intestine is that there are numerous goblet cells. Those goblet cells produce the mucus, which helps to ease the passage of this feces as it eventually empties our body. So again, the large intestine, it contains bacteria that synthesize lots of nutritional factors like vitamin K and B complex, and it also absorbs water that's remaining in undigested chyme that we have not absorbed at this point. So on this slide, we see a diagram which is showing the anatomy of the large intestine. So you can see the different parts of it, beginning with the cecum, the appendix, the lymphatic tissue, the ascending colon, transverse colon, the descending colon, sigmoid colon, and then finally rectum and anal canal. And at the anal canal, there is an external and an internal sphincter. And we'll see those in a couple slides. So there's mesenteries of the abdominal digestive organs, and we can see them here. They are basically a fatty membrane that's going to kind of hold the intestines together. So this is a really good view of the mesentery from an anterior view. So one of the most common homeostatic imbalances associated with the large intestine is an appendicitis. And an appendicitis can be very serious. It can be life-threatening. And it's an acute inflammation of that appendix. And a ruptured appendix, it can lead to peritonitis. So it requires surgical removal very quickly to prevent that, called an appendectomy. So the digestive processes that occur in the large intestine are the haustral contractions. And so those are the mass movements, the slow segmenting movements, mostly in the ascending and the transverse colon. Then there is a gastrocolic reflex, which is initiated by the presence of food in the stomach. So it results in mass movements, the slow, powerful peristaltic movements towards the rectum. So our next slide is showing the different sphincters and their control during defecation. So during defecation, there's nerves from the sacral region of the spinal cord that are first triggered by the presence of feces in the rectum. And this activates sensory nerve fibers that travel to the spinal cord. This is then going to activate a spinal reflex that causes contraction of the rectum and relaxation of the internal anal sphincter. So the internal anal sphincter is involuntary, but the external anal sphincter is voluntary. So we don't empty our bowels until, it's a convenient time. Unfortunately, people that have maybe some sort of spinal injury or dementia, something like that, may not be able to control their external anal sphincter. The same thing happens early in life when children are getting potty trained. And finally, the last slide shows the other homeostatic imbalances associated with the large intestine. Watery stools are called diarrhea, and constipation is just going to be the opposite of that, where the stool becomes hard and very difficult to pass.